So as we think about protein, and of course I'm referring to pollen, bees are starved for protein all year long. They need it to make the vast amount of royal jelly to feed the massive amount of larvae that's developing in that colony. So we've also found that studies show that a variety of pollen is wonderful for bees. If you can live in an area in the summertime where there's an abundance of a variety of pollen, they get different types of minerals and vitamins that they need from different sources of protein, of pollen. Of course, in the wintertime, that's not going to be available, so any protein is going to be sufficient for winter survival. Sometimes you can harvest your own pollen. Many times beekeepers in the spring, bees will have an abundance amount of pollen, and oftentimes beekeepers will actually take it and knock it, take a frame of pollen and bump it onto a table or a sheet of wax paper. And then you can store that, you can freeze it, and then you can feed it back by kind of putting it back into the comb, packing it back into cells, so to speak, and feed it back to your bees in the fall. That's pretty labor intense. That's not something I'm going to do, but it is an option. Certainly making your own pollen supplements like pollen patties, this is good. It requires some careful measuring to get your sugar, simple syrup, and some of your protein powder, which is usually, rarely is it ever real pollen. It's usually a pollen substitute. And I'm very comfortable using the various pollen substitutes that are available, the protein that's available today. There's a lot of good protein out there. Today I want to show you how to make pollen patties. They're real easy to make. Some ingredients I have before me. I've got honeybee healthy, I've got pollen powder, I've got sugar, I got some very hot water, and we're going to mix this all together to make our pollen patties. So what I want to do first is take my really hot water, practically almost boiling, pour it into just sugar, so as I mix it together, it's just a simple syrup compound, and then I'm going to kind of just let that dissolve. I'm going to pour it into my bucket here, and then I'm going to add my pollen powder like this, and just keep stirring it all together. And that's what makes these pollen patties. It's just working it all together. Now I need to add some honeybee healthy, just a few drops. Woo! You want to follow the directions on the jar for the exact measurement on that. Once you get it like this, you just kind of want to mix it together really good. Plop it down on some wax paper like this. You may add or take away some powder. Fold it over. Boom! There you go. Certainly, you can make your own. And you can see in the image here, back in 2008, when I was doing a lot of experimentation, that was 10 years ago, a decade ago. But I was trying to figure out how to feed bees protein in the winter back then by putting pollen patties between the two deep boxes. It was covered with wax paper, and you can see how the bees have eaten, I think, about half of this in order to survive. So bees really are starved for protein in the wintertime. So always consider feeding your bees protein. One of the things I want to mention about vitellogenin is that these levels of vitellogenin increases during the time of a demand for bees to be fed. So in other words, if there is developing larvae in the hive, then certainly the vitellogenin levels have to be stronger for bees to produce this royal jelly for the developing larvae. In a fall dearth, for example, bees will burn through their own stored protein in their fat bodies. They will use it up, and they have no way to replace it. And there's nothing in the comb. So a lot of colonies go into winter with a deficit of protein, a deficit of stored fat bodies, reservoirs of this vitellogenin protein. This vitellogenin also acts not only as a food storage reservoir, but this is exciting. As you feed bees protein, this protein is converted as an antioxidant. and it suppresses oxidative stress damage on the bees. And that simply means that bees live longer. So bees with this ability to have more stored antioxidants, they're able to fight off some of the viruses that the mites vector onto those bees. So this, if I can summarize this, the more you can feed your bees protein, usually what happens, the old paradigm is in July, remember, numbers drop down because there's very little protein available in the way of pollen out in the when bees go foraging, and so the bees are protein stressed. But the mite level is increasing because they're getting more populated in the colony. They're causing more damage to the bees. They're causing a spread of more viruses. But because the bees are running out of vitellogenesis, they're running out of stored fat body protein, antibiotics, suppressing the oxidative stress damage that the mites are causing, then the colony just fades away into this struggle to make it through winter. But if you can keep your levels like I'm advocating, and I practice, keep your levels strong by feeding your bees all fall. As soon as the nectar flow ends in late summer, boom, start feeding them protein. You want to keep a strong colony filled with protein in their fat bodies. You want that antioxidant. You want the suppressing oxidative stress not to be damaging those bees when they're exposed to the viruses that the mites are spreading. So keep the protein, keep feeding them protein and sugar water. And that way, keep your mite levels low and you don't have this collapse or weakening of the colony. It's so cool to put your mind around this and see how easy this is. I was at a big bee conference once, and I heard a popular speaker say that a strong colony eats a ½ pound of protein a day, or 3.5 pounds a week. Can you imagine that? A colony, a beehive, they consume what's equal to a bag of sugar, a 4-pound bag of protein every 7 days. Where are they getting it? They're flying out and bringing it in. But if it's not enough, that they can't find enough, then they're in a protein deprivation. And this is why I'm really advocating find a way, and I'll give you step-by-step way to keep feeding your bees protein. So a colony, you might think, oh, you know, they're just a bunch of bees. They get their food. I don't worry about them. But actually, a colony eats the same amount of food, the entire colony, the 50,000 amount of bees, 50,000 bees, they eat the same amount, they have the same amount of food requirement as a medium-sized dog. So just imagine how much your medium-sized dog eats in the way of dog food. That's the level of protein and carbohydrates that your beehive needs. And they need a lot. And usually they're not getting it. Sometimes they are. You may live in a great place where your bees are bringing in a lot of pollen and storing it. But usually they just bring in a lot of nectar and make a lot of honey, but they have very little protein to build up that winter physiology of 50,000 bees you're going to need to make it through the winter. All right, let's talk about our pre-winter inspection. Here's an old paradigm. You take your bees from a package, shake them in your box in the spring, treat them with some kind of powerful mite killer, and then you leave them alone, keep giving them room to grow, you give them supers, you steal all their honey supers off, and then in the fall you feed them 2-to-1 sugar water to give them food back to replace what you stole, and then you treat them with another type of chemical to kill the mites. You're killing mites twice a year? I mean, what's the reason behind that, right? It's an old paradigm. Studies show that within 30 to 60 days after you kill your mites, they're back at the same level again. And so you can have this spring chemical that you use to destroy mites. Let's say you apply it in April. Well, by June, your mite levels are strong again, and you're in danger of spreading viruses all through the summer months as bees continue to populate and get bigger. So it would be like you going to the doctor and the doctor discovering you have high blood pressure, and he or she wants to put you on medication to reduce your blood pressure. And so you decide to take your medication once in the spring and once in the fall. I mean, what's the reasoning behind that? You're still having damage done between your spring and your fall. That's the same thing that happens in bees. If you fail to keep your mite levels down all year long, they are spreading viruses all year long. So you have to work at keeping your mite levels down the entire bee growing season. You can't keep your mite levels down in the winter time because you just can't open your box up and do much. But between April and October, like here in Illinois, you can do a lot to keep your mite levels low. So don't wait until the last day of the bee season or the first frost. Oh my goodness, we had a frost. I need to go out and inspect my bees and make sure they're going to be okay. Don't wait to get your bees ready for winter after it turns cold. You've got to work on this now. You need to work on it in July and August and September. Start working on it as soon as you can to get your bees through the winter. That's so important. And you need to know in this inspection, this pre-winter inspection, I often refer to it as the last inspection of the year, because it's the last time you can actually get inside your colony. It's going to have to be at least 60, 65 degrees to do an inspection, Fahrenheit. If it's cooler than that, it's not good to do an inspection. It's too hard on the bees, especially the pupa stage of the brood. So you want to do these inspections kind of late summer, early fall. Another reason is because the propolis seal, if you break it too late in the year, it never warms up again for the propolis to kind of re-stick the boxes together, and they can slide around and fall apart, be blown apart during the winter. So you want to do your last inspection, probably where I live in Illinois. My last inspection is going to occur late September or early October, just before I start having my first frost, usually first, second week in October. So I want to have my inspections out of the way by then. Now, when you're doing your fall inspections, there's a lot to consider. You never want to pull frames out unless it's about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. That's important. You can take the top off of your hive. Like a lot of people that buy our winter bee kinds, they actually take the tops off and change out their winter bee kinds in all temperatures. That's fine to do that, but you never want to pull a frame out unless it's at least 65 degrees. So what are we inspecting for during that last inspection of the year that's going to occur late summer or early fall? We're basically looking to inspect for 4 things: the condition of the queen, the population of the colony, the amount of brood, and primarily I'm looking for larvae and cap brood, and then any signs of pests and diseases. These are the things we're looking for in our last inspection of the year. When we talk about the condition of the queen, we're actually wanting just to confirm the presence of the queen. We need to have a strong laying queen in the fall. That's why I really prefer to replace my queens sometime after summer solstice, which is June the 20th, June the 21st. If I can put a new queen in my colony at that time, I just do better getting my hive through the winter with a new queen. Now, if you got a new package that is a new queen, don't worry about it. By all means, if your queen is 2 to 3, 4 years old, wow, time to replace her. You don't want to lose your queen in the winter, because you'll come out of winter, it'd be early spring, you'll do your first inspection and realize that you don't have a queen, and all at once you'll find that there's no way for you to get a queen. It's difficult to buy a queen early spring. Most of the queens that are being produced are going into packages. You want well-mated queens. You can't get well-mated queens too early in the spring. So because of that, don't risk it. Make sure you've got a queen in there, she's laying good, and you're ready to go into winter with a good laying queen. So you're going to have to evaluate the queen. I want you to be looking at her brood pattern every 2 weeks anyway, right? All summer long, you're supposed to inspect your hive every 2 weeks. Not a thorough inspection, just enough to make sure you see eggs and good brood, good laying pattern. That way you're ahead of the ball game. Anytime that starts to fail, you have time to get that queen replaced. So look at the work your queen is doing every 2 weeks. You don't have to find the queen, you just need to see her laying pattern. Now, it may seem impossible to talk about numbers of 60 to 80,000. I would say that is a humongous size colony to have 60 to 80,000 bees. More likely, we're looking at a large colony being 40 to 50 to 60,000. But who knows? Your colony will get large if you feed them plenty of protein and supply them with this protein, the pollen that they need to continue to build up their numbers. They will get larger. And if you keep mite levels down, there'll be less bees dying prematurely, so you will have a larger colony. And again, you want to go into winter with a lot of bees. This is going to be hard for you to do your last inspection, because when you inspect your colony in late September, you'll find that it will be difficult because there's so many bees in there. And it will be very challenging because usually when you do a late summer or a early fall inspection, this is a time of a dearth. And that means there's no available nectar sources or protein sources. All the bees are usually home, which means that bees are robbing each other. They're robbing other hives. So you need to be very careful in doing your last bee inspection in the fall. I recommend you take something like burlap, but cover up the frames when you take your top cover off and you're pulling frames up on your last inspection during a dearth, when bees are looking to rob other colonies. It's not a problem in the spring and summer, but during a dearth it can be. You don't want to leave your hive open too long in the fall, late summer, fall, or you can attract robber bees. That's why I prefer to take a burlap sack or something, a blanket, a towel, keep it covered up, keep the other frames covered while you're looking at a frame, and it can really help hold down the scent of the beehive being open and potentially inviting robbers to come in and rob the hive. So as you think about this cluster getting to be larger and larger for winter survival, you need a lot of bees in that box. And that's why we're talking anywhere 40, 50, 60, up to 80,000 bees. And this is going to help your bees make it through the winter. Smaller numbers in a small cluster are not going to make it. I'm telling you, most of the time people send me their pictures of their bees that died in the winter time, very small populations, only 10,000 bees in there, and they wonder why they died. And that's why they didn't have the numbers to stay warm. Okay, so since you know you need to keep your numbers strong going into winter, that means you got to raise a lot of bees that have winter physiology in the fall. How do you do that? You need to stimulate late summer and early fall rearing of bees. And the way that you do that is by feeding your bees plenty of protein and feed them sugar heavily. So you're going to feed them protein and carbohydrates such as sugar or honey if you want to reintroduce some frames of honey, whatever it takes. And this, coupled with providing a fresh young queen in the summer, gives you the muscle, the power, the things that you need to get your bees through the winter. Feed them heavily with pollen and protein in late summer, early fall, all through the fall, and give them a young queen in the summer. I have a whole nother online class on pests and diseases, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But what you're looking for, as I mentioned, you need to make sure you don't have pests and diseases. Want to make sure that you don't have things like American foul brood, European foul brood. Make sure that you don't have a small hive beetle infestation. They overwinter, the small hive beetle do. So you want to make sure that you're trapping those beetles, cutting those populations down going into winter. Of course, I've stressed this over and over. You got to keep your mite levels low at all times. And there's Nosema ceranae. You want to keep Nosema under control if that's a problem for you. But again, I mentioned these things in my online course on pests and diseases. So let's talk about adequate food storage. I want to warn you, do not use entrance feeders in the fall. Late summer and fall, no entrance feeders. It will induce robbing, okay? That's the little Boardman feeder with the jar that slides into the entrance of your hive. Don't use that in the fall, okay? Hear me clearly. That will cause robbing. You can use that in the spring and early summer, like on a package or something, but not during a dearth, or it will get robbed out. So let's just take that out of the equation. Only use frame feeders or top feeders. Now I designed and invented the Burns Bees feeding system, which is awesome. I wouldn't have invented it if it wasn't awesome. You know, I needed to find a way to feed bees in the fall.
It's a little bit darker than goldenrod. It's orange. They want some white pollen. They are very busy, and this can be very deceiving. You can think that there's a nectar flow that's out of this world. But if you look into the top, this is a hive that 7 days ago I started feeding. So 7 days ago, look at that. They totally have eaten this pollen patty that I put in here. And look, they're below this screen. These are the feeding systems we make. And they're just sitting there begging for more food. And this is entirely drained out. Look at that. Yeah, I know they put a little propolis in a few of the holes, but a lot of the holes are still open. And look at them just wanting more food. Look at that. Feed us. So even though a hive like this in the fall is busy at work, it's never enough food, never enough resources to really give them what they need. You're not going to have to worry about overfeeding your hives. So in my case, I'm doing 1-to-1 sugar water and pollen patties. Now watch these beetles. There's a beetle there. Let's see if I can kill it. Okay, I got it. They like the pollen patties too. And the reason this is attracting beetles is because I didn't have enough space to really, I should have made it smaller. I let it go too big, and it lapped over the side. So you don't want to do that. It's better to cut it where the wax paper is over the top and only the patty is visible to the bees below it rather than up on top here. So if you see that, you know, be careful if you have to do that. Check for beetles underneath this overlap. You know, I saw a couple there. You just don't want to be attracting small hive beetle. Yeah, that's great. And that'll give me room to put my next one on here in just a few minutes. But yeah, you want to keep feeding your bees. Don't let that fall flow deceive you that there's enough food. I can tell by these bees how much they are wanting to consume all this pollen. Take this out of your hive or you will attract beetles again. If you try to find a way to cap off your edges really tight around here and everything fits tight, beetles really don't have access to get in here, but it does, you know, it doesn't take much of a little crack somewhere for the beetles to get in. I needed to find a way to feed them both pollen patties, 1-to-1 sugar water, and 2-to-1 sugar water. That's why I invented this system. So I feed them 2-to-1 for their own storing up, like I said earlier, drying out this heavily syrup mixture and storing it in the comb. And I feed them 1-to-1 in order to stimulate brood production. And then I give them a pollen patty. I push it through the screen, and that gives them the protein that they need. So in the fall, actually, it's going to be in about 1 month from now in August. I'll start feeding my bees with my feeding system, 1-to-1 sugar water, 2-to-1 sugar water, and the pollen powder proteins. And I will feed them August, September, all the way into October, maybe into November if it doesn't get real cold. And then I will change that over to the Winter Be Kind sugar board, protein boards, once it becomes too cold for bees to consume sugar water.
Once the sugar water gets to be about 50 degrees, the bees rarely will consume it. So about the time they start clustering, you need to start feeding them a candy board such as our winter bee kind. Again, we talked about the sugar mixture water in the fall. Don't just give them 2 to 1. That's only for storage. You need to support the brood you want to build up with protein and 1 to 1. Make them think it's spring by the amount of nectar that's coming in artificially by your 1 to 1 sugar water and by the protein you're giving them that makes them think they have a lot of access to pollen. This will build your numbers up. Bees of winter physiology that will live 4 to 6 months. You want to do this in September, October, November for sure. Get them started on building up a lot of populations of bees of winter physiology. And since you kept your mite levels really low, these bees of winter physiology aren't exposed to viruses. They haven't worn themselves out by foraging. And so they're ready to get you all the way through the winter. This is so cool, a new paradigm in beekeeping. Now, if you've just discovered me, you may not realize that I created and invented the Winter Bee Kind winter board. It consists of insulation to cut down on condensation in the colony, in the hive. It also provides ventilation at the top, where bees also use that to take their flights or cleansing flights in the wintertime, where normally they can't take a cleansing flight. That cleansing flight opening that allows them to take a cleansing flight allows them to take more cleansing flights more often, and that reduces the microsporidium nosema that can really grow in the gut of the bee during the wintertime. So the more often they can take that cleansing flight, that is so cool. So with the entrance at the top, we're getting rid of moisture and we're allowing the bees to take that cleansing flight. Normally bees rarely take an entrance, rarely go down to the entrance because they're clustered up high in the hive, and they rarely go all the way down, break cluster and fly out of the hive unless it gets really warm. So all winter long, bees are struggling to relieve themselves, and as they don't do that, if they don't defecate regularly, the buildup in their gut can cause that microsporidium nosema to really grow during the winter. So this Winter Bee Kind, I just made that entrance at the top on the candy board in order to get rid of moisture. And it does. I see icicles forming as they blow the moist air out of the hive. However, I didn't realize it until I began to observe it, that bees were actually taking cleansing flights at 20 degrees Fahrenheit and then coming right back in the hive. So this allows the bees to consume the candy, take cleansing flight, keep their gut healthy, and keep eating protein and sugar from the Winter Bee Kind board in order to support the growth, the population increase that they have in feeding larvae all winter long. It's so simple to think about how to get bees through the winter if you think about how to feed them and how to allow them to relieve themselves and to raise a lot of new bees. And the populations just get stronger all winter long. Candy boards are not a new invention. They've been around, way back. I read about them in the 1800s, but I decided to add essential oils and proteins and amino acids, along with the strong protein that bees need is mixed into that sugar water. And some of you know also that in the fall, I really advocate putting a teaspoon of pollen powder in your sugar water as you feed bees to help them have that protein as they consume that sugar water as well. That's what we're doing in the wintertime. When they consume the hard candy, they're actually getting these particles of protein in their bodies as well. So let me just take you through the feeding process. The spring feeding, when you come out of winter, my hives have my Winter Bee Kind board on them. They've eaten those. They eat 2 or 3 of those all through the winter. How much they consume of a Winter Bee Kind depends on how much they want to. Sometimes they eat them in 2 weeks. We refill them, or we send them out with a recipe for you to make your own, or you can get them back here for us to refill if you live locally. But I would say on average, mine consume about 3 of those. They're about 5 pounds of protein and sugar. So my bees, in addition to I leave 1 superon, which is about 35 pounds of honey. But in addition to that, they eat another 15 pounds of this sugar protein mixture as well. You can also use other feeders as well, like some people might say, what about a frame feeder? You take a frame out and you put a reservoir in place of a frame or two that holds sugar water. Well, that you're reducing your brood area because you have to lose a frame or two. Each frame holds 7,000 cells, so if you take 2 frames out, you're down 14,000 bees. So I don't like that idea. Plus, it's labor intense. You've got to take the hive apart to refill it. You don't want to do that in the wintertime. Entrance feeders, as I said, you don't want to do that in the fall. You can do that in the spring, but it's certainly not a good option. So feeding bees in the spring, use my same Burns Bee feeding system, and you feed them 1-to-1 in the spring along with pollen patties. And then when you get into summer, no need to feed your bees anymore in the summer because they've got plenty of resources available to them. But then in the fall, like I said, you want to put your Burns feeding systems back on. You use them in the spring, save them, and now you start feeding your bees. Soon as the nectar stops, soon as there's a nectar flow that's going really strong and it ends in the summer, feed your bees. They're growing. They need to keep growing, and feed them 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 and protein in the fall. Switch to a winter bee kind when the colony gets too cold and they cluster at 50 degrees. That's all you got to remember. Feed them liquid when they can fly and relieve themselves. Feed them the winter bee kind board during the winter when they take their occasional cleansing flights out of the entrance at the top in this winter bee kind board.